Hey everyone, what's going on? Today we're going to be taking a look at this new game called Once Human. Now this video is sponsored by Starry Studios. They asked me to check out the game and share it with you. I've been keeping an eye on this one since it was first revealed, as it is a genre and type of game that tends to fall into my wheelhouse of interest. Well, now after playing for nearly 20 hours over the past couple of days, I got a pretty good idea of what the game is all about. That's the point of this. We're going to jump in, talk about its systems, features, and just give you an idea of what is Once Human. So let's jump into it. It is described as a multiplayer open world survival game set in a strange post-apocalyptic future. Now things open up with a brief tutorial that introduces you to the basics of movement, combat, and the otherworldly elements of the game. In fact, at the start, you'd almost think this was a linear, psychological thriller or something, with you shifting through dimensions, speaking to ethereal beings, playing the piano, and then fighting strange creatures with lamps for heads, or this one with a radio tower for a head. But the tutorial, more so than anything, is there to kind of set the tone of the world and story, but not really the game's structure, because after not too long, you leave this linear introduction and are dropped into the real game. And I mean quite literally dropped into it, actually, as you find yourself floating high above the starting zone of what is Once Human's open world, third-person, looter-shooter survival game. It is quite the mouthful of genres, but there is a lot going on in this one. Now, right from the start, the survival elements are on display as you are asked to gather logs and rocks to construct your first small camp. At this camp, you're able to take other early game materials and craft your first few pieces of gear. Now, when I got started on my playthrough, as I was going around looking for said materials, I stumbled into a nearby town and a pop-up displayed in the upper corner that said Explore Throughville. It gave me a few tasks. It said defeat 9 normal enemies, find weapon and gear crates, along with finding the mysterious treasure. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but this was actually my first experience with a stronghold. All throughout this game, in every single zone, there are tons of these such locations, each of which have a similar list of tasks that, when complete, give you some bonus rewards. Basically, these are like major points of interest set at distinct locations that will be full of enemies to fight, loot to find, and various quests to complete. Outside of the game's survival elements, this is a major component of the entire experience. In fact, I would say of the 20 or so hours I've played now, I've spent about half of my time going around the map and clearing strongholds like this one, in addition to doing the other various PvE activities like world events and boss fights, which we will get to a little later in the video. But to start out, I went to my camp, I constructed my camp, I went to it, I made a few items like some consumables and a pickaxe, and then I headed into that nearby town, that stronghold, and I cleared it. I killed the 9 enemies, actually killed many more than that. I found both the weapons and the gear crates, as well as the mysterious treasure, which rewarded blueprints for crafting, among a few other things. Now, after gathering the basic materials to build my camp and clearing that town, the game pretty much completely opens up. You do have your primary task, which initially is to place a territory and construct your first building, like making your first real base. But outside of that, pretty much able to go and do as you please. You can go around clearing the strongholds, like this first location that I came across. You can harvest materials for crafting. You can hunt wildlife for making food. You can pick up various side quests from NPCs in towns or ones found around the world, or you can just continue to progress along the main quest, which introduces you to the game's various elements and features. But you're able to do this at kind of whatever pace and in whatever order that you want. Like, yes, a lot of the main systems are gated behind moving through the main story quest, but the game is just, it drops you in and it's just completely open. You could just focus on gathering materials for hours or going around clearing strongholds and collecting loot. You really can do it in whatever order you want. It is very, very much so an open world that you're free to approach however you like. And after playing the game for these past few days, I gotta say that Once Human really does feel like a good blending of survival game mechanics and features, along with being an open world looter shooter. In a lot of ways, it actually reminds me of other games that I've played and enjoyed in the past, like Defiance or Firefall, or it's kind of like what The Day Before said they were going to be, but this is an actual real game. Like, there's actually a game here, systems and features and stuff to do. unlike the day before. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the various elements, features, and mechanics that are within Once Human. And let's actually start out with the survival stuff. So there are numerous survival mechanics in the game beyond the gathering, crafting, and base building. There are systems for stamina, sanity, hydration, and hunger. So stamina, as you run or perform activities, this drains. It's actually a fairly generous compared to some stamina systems I've seen in other survival games. It takes a very long time for your stamina to deplete, and it regenerates almost instantly once you stop moving. Oftentimes, I don't even notice that there's a stamina system. That's how not in my face it is. There is a thirst meter as well. Over time, you get thirsty. You drink water and other beverages to refill your thirst, and your thirst level, along with your hunger, are broken up into 4 different tiers. Depending on where you are within those tiers, it will impact things. So for thirst, when you're between 60 and 100%, you get 20% extra sprint speed, and also sprinting costs 50% less stamina. And the hunger system is similar to that. It depletes with time. You eat food to fill it. It is also broken up into 4 tiers, these ones impacting your health and carry capacity. Now, in my experience, you rarely ever fully run out of any of these, really, stamina, thirst, or hunger, and the sources of both food and water are pretty plentiful in the game. Like, if you're actively playing, it really isn't difficult at all to keep these up. And then the final survival mechanic is the sanity meter. So certain activities, areas, and encounters in the world will lower your sanity level. As your sanity drops, it reduces your max HP. So this includes things like eating certain foods, drinking polluted water, fighting otherworldly enemies, or spending times in these pollution zones. All of these things will deplete your sanity, and your max health depletes in direct proportion to your sanity level. And then once your sanity drops below 50%, you actually start getting debuffs. Now, there will be certain consumables you can use to regain sanity, or if you rest back in bed at your base, you can regenerate your sanity level. There are also even gear sets in the game that will have like large amounts of sanity depletion resistance to help lower the rate and amount of sanity that you use. Another basic survival system that is in this game as well is base building. So as mentioned earlier, you start off with this little camp, but that's like the mobile base. Really, things get started once you place your first territory. Now, these can be put down actually pretty much anywhere in the world. The only real restriction that I've seen is that you can't place one too close to a stronghold or on certain terrain like roads. You also can't place a territory overlapping with another territory, but outside of those restrictions, you can put your territory and build a base pretty much anywhere in the open world. In fact, while playing the game, you're constantly seeing people's bases all over the place, in the middle of the forest, in a field, along the road, in a ravine. Wherever you go, you will be bumping into other player-built buildings, structures, and facilities, all dotted in the landscape between the game's major points of interest and strongholds. There's just player bases everywhere. At least that's been the case in the early zones that I've seen in the game so far. So after you build your camp, pretty much within the first hour of playing, you are then asked to place down a territory. And then once you claim a territory, like I said, pretty much wherever you want, beyond a few restrictions, most of the open world you can put your territory down in. Once it's placed down, you can then start constructing your base using whatever templates you've unlocked so far. So there are like basic structural templates for floors, walls, ceilings, roofs, stairs, windows, and doors. There are various facilities like crafting stations, storage, fortifications, and power generation. There's furniture and wallpapers that you can do to customize your buildings. And then there is a house blueprint system that actually lets you copy your exact building to duplicate and or move it. And after you've built a base in your territory, the game actually lets you freely move it around. So you can actually like pick up and change the position of your base within your territory's parameters. Or outside of that, you can literally move the entire territory itself, taking it to a completely new spot anywhere on the map, so long as it doesn't overlap with another player territory or is in one of those restricted areas, like I mentioned, near strongholds or on a road or certain terrain. You can move the whole thing whenever. On top of this, there's a guild housing system. It's called your hive in Once Human. That's what the name of guilds are. So you can either form or join a hive. This puts you in a collective group with other people, and you can also then place down a hive territory that everyone within your guild or within your hive can build and or use. The base building in this game is pretty generous, I would say. Like, it doesn't take much time harvesting resources before you can construct an entire building, which is something that I really appreciate. It's very easy to get started and put down a basic structure within which you can put down your crafting stations, your processing, your storage, all of that stuff. Everything that you expect from base building in survival games is pretty much present here in Once Human. And then, of course, to go along with that is the harvesting system. To get those resources for base building and for gear crafting, you'll have to go out there and gather. All of the usual fare is here. You've got various types of trees, ores, rocks, herbs, flowers, fruits, vegetables, and animals that can be harvested, gathered, and processed in service of making your base consumables and gear. Oh, and that camp that I mentioned earlier, one of those first structures that you build, this is actually acting as a mobile respawn point. Oftentimes, whenever we come up to a difficult location, whether it's a boss fight or a challenging stronghold or whatever, any outdoor activity that we think we might die, you just plop down a camp nearby so that you have a close by respawn location if you do happen to die, because otherwise you can only respawn at certain towers, the fast travel towers, or back at your main base that's set within your territory. So that's a synopsis of a lot of these survival features, but the survival is only a portion of the game. Really, at least what is more appealing to me and feels like a bigger chunk of my personal play experience is all like the looter shooter elements, the open world RPG, going out, fighting, doing activities, going to points of interest, doing PvE stuff, fighting enemies, bosses, collecting materials, and loot. The world is completely open, as I mentioned. There is no loading screens as you're moving through a zone. You're just freely able to walk around, going around to all these different spots, exploring, and in the process, as you're moving through the zone, you're gonna see all of the vegetation and animals, all of that survival stuff to collect, the flora and the fauna, but it's also full of all these different locations and points of interest. So as discussed earlier, there are the strongholds, and this is one of the major form of PvE activity. These consist of various settlements, outposts, hospitals, military bases, all sorts of structures that have a number of objectives to complete, which will then reward experience, loot, and currencies. There are also missions that can be found at a lot of these. Some will be acquired in the nearest town, others you'll just see as you approach the area. And the challenges, like in that very first town that I came across, these will include things like kill X number of enemies, defeat elites, kill bosses, find weapon and armor caches, and they almost always also have a mysterious treasure hidden somewhere within the area for you to discover. Now, outside of that like basic checklist that every stronghold will have, where if you complete the checklist, you're gonna get that like bonus experience and rewards, there's also a lot of like secrets and in many times puzzles nestled within each of these locations. And actually, one of the things that we've really enjoyed while playing through the game is the amount of variety that every single stronghold location, all of these points of interest have of additional things to do within them. So sometimes, for example, you'll come up to a location that will have a shutdown electrical component, like a door that's locked, or an elevator that you need to find a fuse and put it in a fuse box that then lets you power it up and actually use that. Sometimes there will be puzzles or bosses or other sort of challenges within these points of interest, within these strongholds, that you have to get across before you can actually progress forward. One of the ones that we came across that was the most interesting, though, was in this big hospital area. We found a guy nearby who was calling for help, and we approached him, and he explained that he had like lost his wife, but also lost some medical supplies, and he wanted us to go retrieve them. So we went into the hospital. This area was a lot denser. There was a good amount of enemies there, lots of verticality. There's a ton of different buildings and stuff. You have to look around, searching around the hospital, going through the different levels, fighting enemies along the way. And eventually we made our way onto the area where we found the specific supplies that we were looking for. But interacting with the supplies then teleported us to another dimension. It was a room with 4 doors, one in each cardinal direction. Now, as you move through the doors, it actually kept bringing you back to that same room, and it was confusing. You'd go through the doors, I'm still in the same room. I checked every direction, I was always in the same room. But eventually we noticed that there was a calendar on the wall in the door, and every time you checked the calendar, when you moved a room, the date would change. And essentially how it worked was, depending on the direction that you moved, north, south, west, or east, it would change either forward or backwards the month and the day. And we had to essentially get it onto a certain day before we were able to leave this never-ending maze of rooms and progress the story forward. I mean, this was really interesting, and this is just one example of sort of this additional activity that these strongholds can have beyond the checklist of killing enemies and finding loot crates, essentially, and killing elites or bosses. There'll be additional things in there. We've come across quite a few strongholds. Most of the strongholds actually have an additional layer to them outside of that checklist, which is really, really neat. And I think probably one of the more surprising things about this game so far, that with our playtime with it, is that we have kept coming across unexpected things at these strongholds and out in the open world. And if things continue like they have for these first 20 or so hours, there appear to be hundreds of areas in the game that all will have unique different twists twist to them beyond that initial checklist, which if that holds up throughout the course of continuing to play the game, even though we've only gone through the first couple of zones in these first 20 hours, there's already been consistent variety. And if that keeps up, that is really, really interesting. Now, beyond all of these strongholds and stuff, the world is filled with all sorts of other stuff. There's like interesting dynamic world events that can pop up. On a few occasions, we would just be out in the world and then all of a sudden a fog would roll in, like super, super thick, not being able to see but a few meters in front of you. And there was a massive warning timer that popped up as well, but it was a countdown to 0, after which point I'm assuming you probably died. We've seen roaming world bosses. There was a time where I was in my base and I looked out the front door and there was this school bus with 4 legs stampeding past my house. Or sometimes in those strongholds that we mentioned, there can be massive bosses that will appear. Like when we were in Overlook Town at the stadium, we saw this giant 4-story creature that had a big flower for a head. There's also these horde mode events that can appear in certain parts of the world where you fight off waves of enemies. And there's other notable points of interest around the map, like NPC-filled towns with vendors and side quests for you to complete. There are teleportation towers letting you quickly move across the world, but you actually have to physically go to and unlock these before you can use them. And there's a bunch of small enemy camps outside of the strongholds. There are smaller versions of little towns, encampments, structures, and areas full of enemies dotted all around the map. Beyond all of this, in terms of PvE, the game also has large-scale, difficult to take on boss battles. These are called monoliths, so we've come across 2 of them so far in our playtime. The first one was Foul Shadow Hunter, this twisted mutant with a massive gun in one hand. We had to shoot the gun out of his hand before we could actually deal any damage to him directly. In addition to this gun, he summoned a bunch of ads. He got this rocket launcher, which he would shoot rockets that tracked you down, and he would also spew out pools of poison. This worked in multiple phases. We had to shoot the gun, go through the phases, kill the ads, avoid the rockets, rinse and repeat. And then we also fought this tree ant boss, which was just a massive tree creature. It had this lady in its head that would like make noises and summon in and cast all these magical spells. They would summon up these giant tree branches that we would have to destroy before we could attack the boss, spit out these bubbles that would track us around the map. You had to dodge them the last second as it got really close to you. It also at a few points shot out this giant massive laser beam that you had to try to line of sight. And those are just the first 2 boss battles we've seen. As far as I know, there are going to be quite a few more in the game. That's just what we've come across in the progression through the main story up to this point. I do also want to mention, I don't have any personal experience with it in my first 20 hours, but I do know this game will have PvP. From what I've seen in research, it looks like there's going to be some form of base rating. I know that the game will have like PvP specific servers, and if you join that server, you can engage in this base rating and defense PvP system, presumably for some really good rewards. Now, a form of PvP that we do have experience with, though, is the open world PvP. There will be portions of the map that are flagged and labeled. If you mouse over them, they basically say like a conflict zone, and there's just full-on PvP within these segmented off regions. Although they are fairly easy to avoid, as you walk towards one, there's just this massive wall of color, and then when you cross the threshold, full PvP is enabled, and they've got like special events going on where you basically compete with others to try to be the winner and get a bunch of cool stuff. But that's not what happened to us. We just like instantly died. We had no idea what was going on. Now, it wouldn't be a loot-based game. It wouldn't be like a looter shooter style game if it weren't for progression, and there are quite a few progression systems in the game, starting with the cradle. This is the backpack that you carry around with you at all time, and it's tied into your character and crafting progressions. So first there's the memetics, which is a progression tree to unlock the various aspects of base building and crafting. As you play, doing various activities, you unlock points for this, and you spend points in any of the 5 categories depending on what you want at the time. So there's territory construction, which gives you the basics of base building, including being able to place the walls, ceilings, floors, doors, storage, lights, and stairs. There are facilities, which unlock the higher tiers of armor and weapons crafting. Tactical supplies is for ammo, explosives, healing, and other consumables. Fortification is for base defenses, traps, and turrets, and then logistics is for cooking, water purification, and power generation. As you start the game, you will have the base level versions of base building and crafting, but to get those higher tiers, those later level things, you unlock this through the memetics tree. And then with the cradle, there's also called the cradle override system. Now, these are powerful passive buffs that will enhance your combat capabilities. You unlock these by doing some of the main pinnacle content in the game, like defeating those large boss monoliths that we mentioned. Going through the campaign, defeating those gives you access to new cradle overrides, and yeah, these are really strong buffs that increase like your offensive capabilities, for example, letting you specialize with certain weapon types that you want to enhance. Also, as part of the game's progression is the blueprint and gear system. So blueprints, as you play, you discover both armor and weapons blueprints. You find blueprints at many of those major points of interest, the strongholds, and by completing certain main and side story quests. Now, once you unlock the blueprints for making something, you can then take the materials needed for and then craft them. There's also a subsystem of blueprint fragments where you collect bits and pieces of blueprints and then you put them together for the full blueprint, or you can feed them to enhance blueprints, increasing their star rating, which just increases their overall power. Those blueprints are used to fuel the gear, the weapons and armor. A majority of the gear, with the exception of a few melee weapons I found out in the wild, most gear is acquired via crafting. So you've got spots for 2 ranged weapons, 1 melee, and then there are gear slots for a helm, goggles, gloves, boots, chest, and legs. Gear will come in multiple rarities. The higher the rarity, the better the stats, and the better the passive and active abilities. All craftable armor in the game is found via getting those blueprints. It has to be crafted with materials you gather, and also the armor will be parts of sets that will have set bonuses, with thresholds unlocking stronger bonuses. These will be focused on harvesting and gathering, focused on crafting, focused on being defensive or offensive in various elements, focused on things like resistances to help you reduce sanity loss. Ton of different sets with different bonuses depending on what sort of thing you want to focus on. Beyond the different rarities, gear will also come in several tiers. The higher the tier, the better the stats. However, to make those higher tiers, they're going to cost rarer, more difficult to acquire resources. Also, all of the game's crafting does require use of some energy. So the game does have an energy system for many major elements. This includes unlocking those various progression things in your cradle. This includes crafting gear. This even includes doing things like fast travel. For now, I do know that you're able to get energy from certain containers in the world that you find, or specifically, we've seen you get a lot of energy when killing bosses at the various strongholds. There will almost certainly be other energy sources that I'm just not aware of or that we haven't yet come across within our 20 hours of play. But yes, this game does have an energy system tied to a lot of major things. There's also a system of mods. This is pretty straightforward. You will attach a mod to the corresponding piece of gear and get some bonus, either increasing your damage, defenses, or things like your movement speed. So that is a basic overview of most of the major elements and components and features within Once Human. Now, without a doubt, I do want to say here, with a game like this that has so many different forms of currencies, multiple resources, and that energy system, the question still remains about monetization. This is one of those things where we'll have to wait and see exactly where it lands when it releases, but I am expecting the typical assortment of paid for features to bypass time or grinding gates. As is the case with any game like this, my philosophy is I will go in enjoying what I can before hitting those limitations and checking out. It is yet to be determined where exactly Once Human will fall on the spectrum. We will have to wait and see until release to know for certain, but yes, lots of currencies, lots of different resources, and an energy system. Now, all of that said, the base version of this game, as I mentioned at the top, it reminds me of games that I've played and enjoyed quite a bit in the past. It reminds me a bit of Defiance. It reminds me a bit of Firefall, and I really enjoyed both of those games. I enjoyed the structure, I enjoyed the open world nature, I enjoy the RPG elements, I enjoy the looter shooter elements. There's a lot about this game that are, even in just these first 20 hours, I've found very appealing. A lot of times when I do sponsored dedicated videos, it will either have to be for a game that I've played and enjoyed in the past so that I'm fairly confident in, or B, an upcoming game that I haven't tried yet, but I'm interested in because of its genre or because it looks like a game that might be appealing to me. This was in the category of B. This is a genre of game. This is a type of game that I typically enjoy, so I wanted to check it out, and I was happy to provide a basic overview of it. But it's not always the case that I come away from one of these, doing one of these sponsored videos, wanting to continuously play the game after making it, even if it is something that I enjoy. But that has been the case with Once Human. They have done something here with crafting their open world and their balancing of survival and looter shooter mechanics that I have found quite appealing. And once this video is done, I am expecting to continue to play in the coming weeks. But my own personal experience aside and my own impressions aside, the main goal of a video like this is just to inform you and share with you what type of game that it is. So hopefully now that you've seen this, you have a better idea of what Once Once Human is all about now that we've given you an overview of many of its major systems and features. I've only played a little over 20 hours at this point, and with a game like this that is basically just scratching the surface, there's still clearly much more for me to see, learn, and know about before I have a complete understanding of the totality of the game. But hopefully, ideally, the point of this was to act as a good primer and an introduction to see if it's something that you might be interested in. So thanks again to Starry Studios for sponsoring today's video. Now, Once Human is currently in a beta test. They will be holding this test from now through the end of the month. It is available to anyone. All you need to do is head onto the website, register, and download the client. If you're interested, there'll be a link below for you to do just that. Thank you for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you guys next time.